Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lorenzo Monaco. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast and the continuation of our journey through the early Renaissance. We've thus far discussed a great number of the social and the economic factors of the period, that is, from the mid-1300s into the 1400s, and now it's time to take a closer look at the development of the art in the period, which is what we do best around here. We're looking at the turn of the century now. Painters, specifically the celebrated Lorenzo Monaco and Gentile da Fabriano. When it comes to periodization, these painters really toe the line between medieval and Renaissance artists. Still, I would say in this proto-Renaissance moment. More specifically, they are referred to as Gothic painters. No, that does not mean that they dye their hair black and listen to death metal, nor does it mean that they write 19th century horror novels. Gothic art is a medieval art that started in France, famously in Saint-Denis under the Abbot Suger in the 12th century. It began predominantly as an architectural movement for cathedral building that was designed to inspire greater devotion and piety, as well as build larger spaces to accommodate the large number of pilgrims that were journeying along pilgrim routes through Germany, France, and into Spain and into Italy. The features we see in the architecture coming from Gothic France, they include pointed arches as opposed to Roman rounded arches, ribbed vaulting, that is where two pointed arches extend to form a vault and they intersect, and that creates this really intricate design in the vaulting. Highly decorated surfaces with sculpture, something called a trefoil, that is the little three-leaf clover-looking thing, and pinnacles topped on top of the pointed arches, among many, many other things. These are some things to keep in mind because they play an essential role in the formation of Gothic painting in Proto-Renaissance Italy. In previous episodes, we've discussed the influence of the Gothic architecture in the Florence Cathedral, with Brunelleschi, Arnolfo di Cambio, and that history, as well as the development of a unique Venetian aesthetic that we call Venetian Gothic. All of this is to say that by 1400, in the days of Lorenzo Monaco and Gentile da Fabriano, our artist in question today, the Gothic style was in the latest part of its lifespan in Italy. Known to some as late Gothic, it's also referred to as International Gothic. Sometimes those are interchangeable, sometimes they are not, and there's a lot of confusion about terminology that I will try to clarify the best I can. So again, we're faced with a terminology dispute. How can we refer to something as international if there really were no nations, as we know them today? Is it a word that suggests the amalgamation, cross-cultural content within a visual work? Yeah, that's true. All this to say is that I will use late Gothic and International Gothic throughout this episode, somewhat interchangeably. I will specify when necessary. When we get to the works, I'll point out the ways in which we can string together these various stylistic influences. This ties in well with our previous discussion and repositions the artist as a visual intermediary between different worlds that are growing in connectivity. That is, courts in the north, courts in Spain, courts in the Islamic world, courts in France, and one that is desperately trying to persevere in the face of war and plague. Remember, every 10 years or so. For our artists in question, it's notable that neither of them were originally Florentine. Lorenzo Monaco was from Siena, but he did apprentice in Florence, and Gentile was from Fabriano. That is why he is called Gentile da Fabriano, which is a town in the Marches. We say in English, Marches, Le Marche, which is a region in modern Italy. Now we refer to that area as the Marches, which made up part of the Papal States. So Gentile is not Florentine. Lorenzo is Tuscan. He apprentices in Florence. Both artists are given biographies in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. We talk about this a lot. Let's recall that Vasari is among the most important Renaissance biographers who compiled an enormous series of artists' lives for his patron, the Medici Dukes, in the 16th century. And he's effectively setting the boundaries for how we today continue to periodize Italian art, and that matters for our discussion from the transition of Gothic to Renaissance art. While Vasari is always biased, he's always biased and not entirely accurate. His work does help us glimpse into the way in which stylistic developments and shifts in taste were received not just in our moment, but in the Renaissance, that they were aware of these changes and enough to write about them and spell them out. And that's not just by our modern eyes. So we're looking into the 15th and 16th century mindset when we use Vasari, even though he's really 16th century. Vasari divides his text, the lives of the artist, or the lives of the most eminent and excellent painters and sculptors, something like that. It's a very long title. We'll call it the lives, or the lives of the artist. He divides it into three parts, where, of course, his own time, his own moment, he considers the absolute pinnacle of artistic mastery. That's part three, another golden age, so to speak, and he claims is due to the divine works of Michelangelo. For him, it does not get better than Michelangelo. Parts one and two, though, that we're going to sort of look at these categories, they categorize artists by the way in which they furthered art away from the medieval style and towards what we consider to be Renaissance art. This is important. For Vasari, Lorenzo Monaco appears in part one, but Gentile in part two, even though Lorenzo and Gentile lived in the same date range with only a difference of 2 years. So we're looking at 1370 to 1425. So two painters from the same moment are put into two different parts based on their departure from the medieval precedent. Although Vasari was Christian, he criticized the early Christian world for the destruction of the art of the pagan world and the subsequent loss of the art and the techniques to make it, which he says is the result of guidance by nature. To be guided by nature is to make good art. The ancients knew how to do this. By the Christians destroying the ancient world, we have to work to rediscover it. Renaissance, rebirth, right? Part one in Vasari's lives then is comprised of the artist who first began to look at nature again and to shift away from previous abstracted medieval styles. For Vasari, of course, that was a negative value judgment, but we know today that medieval abstraction is a cultural and stylistic choice rather than a blatant lack of skill. So we don't like to get along with Vasari's idea that the medieval arts are some degraded form. We know better than that. But he wanted to uphold the supremacy of his time, his culture, and his artists. He was also a painter, which tells you something. Lorenzo Monaco is in part one among the likes of artists like Giotto, who we've talked about, and Taddeo Gaddi, and many others from this period in art history, about 1300s, turn of the 1200s into the 1400s. Lorenzo was a monk of the Camaldolese order, which gave him the name Monaco. Monaco means monk. Lorenzo the monk, right? He's lauded for his exceptional colors, his gentle and pious nature that reads through his artistic compositions. He was a monk in the monastery of Santa Maria degli Angeli in Florence, okay? Born in Siena, trained in Florence, a monk in a monastery in Florence, for which he painted his stunning Gothic altarpiece, the Coronation of the Virgin, in 1414, which means it's really the last decade of his career. The work, which is now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, is done in the traditional medium of the early 1400s, that is egg tempera on wood panel. Keep in mind that the whole of this work includes the main central image, the predella, which is that group of small narratives below the main image, and the highly ornate Gothic frame. All of this creates a unified whole in the Gothic style, but with some small changes. To remind you, an altarpiece typically goes exactly where you would expect it, at the high altar of a church or a convent or a monastery or what have you. And this is the area where the sacred mass takes place, where the wine and the bread becomes the body and blood of Christ, and practicing Catholics practice this ritual of the altar. An altarpiece is to signify the altar, but also to decorate it with a holy scene. So let's look at this. I want to remind you, Lorenzo Monaco's Coronation of the Virgin. If you can look it up, of course, I'll have pictures posted. Take a look at this beautiful work of art. Here in the middle, the Virgin Mary is being coronated. She's being crowned as the Queen of Heaven. She's flanked by saints and apostles who you can identify by their very standardized iconography. St. Peter with the keys, St. John with his camel skin and his long cross, and on and on and on. Background, this is important. It's entirely gold leaf that is very, very thin, hammered out gold that gets put down on a type of adhesive, which was normal for altarpieces in this period. Below their feet, the rings of heaven make this blue arch. You have a look, it's riddled with stars. There's different rings of heaven based on the mythology of the period, and that shows some of them in which Christ is crowning the Virgin Mary as Queen of Heaven in the heavens surrounded by the apostles. So this is a scene from paradise.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
We see some borrowings from Giotto, that is in the chiaroscuro, the modeling of the faces as well, and the draperies. Let me remind you what chiaroscuro is. It is the use of light and dark colors in order to create shade, depth, naturalism. Remember, we're talking about mastery over nature, and the artist's role to do that, based on Vasari's assessment, is the closer you get to that, the better you are. But we still don't have any perspective. It's stacked. There's an attempt at recession, but it's not necessarily successful, right? This is what we would call not rationalized space. That's something that's going to come in the High Renaissance, and in the early Renaissance too. Look closely. The elements of Gothic architecture are present that we talked about above. Pinnacles are at the top of the frame showing the Annunciation. Look right above. It's divided into three parts. You have Christ or God the Father, I'm not sure, right in the middle in a pinnacle. To the left of Christ or God, the Archangel Gabriel swoops in, and to the right is the Virgin Mary, and this is the announcement that she will bear the Son of God. So these are the pinnacles, but they've illustrated the pinnacles. So it looks like architecture, but it's not, right? And they're pointed like Gothic arches, just as the painted architecture in the main scene of the tabernacle is an entire piece of Gothic architecture. You can see the pointed arch of the frame. You can see the trefoil arch, actually. The inside of the arch is rounded, but it has the trefoil, and it makes a ribbed vault on the inside. Okay, this too has pinnacles on each of the corners. Do you see them? Have a look. Yet, the three sections are actually divided by Roman arches. That means rounded arches, but they're all decorated with this Gothic flair of tracery. That is all of these little ornamental pieces that go all the way around the border, all the way around the arches of the frame. His colors are brilliant. His bright whites, deep reds, and a magnificent blue. And I'm going to tell you about that blue. It is made from a precious stone called lapis lazuli, which is among the most impressive and expensive painting materials in Renaissance Florence, more expensive than the gold. So, to the Renaissance mind, the blue of Christ's cloak, of Mary's cloak above in the Annunciation scene, that is the most expensive material in this painting. Although Lorenzo is displaying masterful skill in his production of the painting, the actual making of the craft of this altarpiece, there is something typical about it. It is a Gothic altarpiece with standard gilding. I don't want to say no innovation, but nothing particular on the subject matter or the composition. His colors are extremely vibrant, and the work is above average in skill and application. So this is not to knock Lorenzo Monaco. His paintings are localized. They are for the place they are meant to be. That sounds like an obvious one, but they're focused. They're devotional. They display their function without question. What it does is maintain the innovations already established by Giotto. With that in mind, we can see how Vasari placed him in part one of his lives, among artists who began to move towards naturalism, who followed Giotto, who are merely stepping stones to later developments, to something entirely removed from the Gothic style. Gentile da Fabriano, he appears in part two of Vasari's lives, sharing a chapter with Pisanello, who I love, a very important painter and sculptor medalist, right, who I have discussed before in terms of his portrait medal of the Byzantine Emperor John VIII Paleologus. That was the Christmas special with the Magi. Why do we find two painters of very similar period and style as divided by Vasari, though? I'm going to read to you from my edition of Vasari's Lives, the translated edition from Oxford World Classics, preface to part two, where he clarifies his division. Vasari says, in the first and most ancient period, the three arts may be seen to exist in a state very far from their perfection, and although they may have possessed some good qualities, they are accompanied by so many imperfections that they certainly do not deserve great praise. Still, since they provided, if nothing else, a beginning as well as the method and style for the better art which subsequently followed, it is impossible not to speak well of them and to attribute to them a bit of glory which, if they are to be judged according to the perfect rules of art, the works themselves did not deserve. In the second period, there is a clear improvement in invention and execution, with better design and style and greater accuracy. And so, artists cleaned away the rust of the old style, along with the awkwardness and lack of proportion typical of the coarseness of those times, which was the cause. Okay? So Vasari is basically saying, artists from the first part, from the first age, Lorenzo Monaco, Giotto, Taddeo Gaddi, and all the others, they deserve some glory for stepping away, but they didn't really do anything great. Now we're going to see some artists who do some great works. And this is still not part three. This does not arrive to Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, who are all in part three. So his treatment of Gentile biography is short and he's really overshadowed by Pisanello. It is in this light that Gentile has been consistently praised for his work as one who takes significant steps towards what will become the Renaissance style, but still is very much considered international Gothic. Looking at his most prized masterpiece, one that we have talked about before, his Adoration of the Magi from around 1423, that is less than 10 years from Lorenzo's coronation, we should not be surprised by that wide range of stylistic influence that makes this so-called international. Remember, Gentile was from Le Marche. It was just near Urbino. As early as 1390, he was painting in Lombardy in the very court of Gian Galeazzo Visconti. Remember him, the Duke of Milan, who tried to conquer northern Italy and then died of plague? him, right? Gentile painted a Madonna and Child with Saints Francis and Clare for him, giving us a Christ child that looks more like a baby and less like George Costanza than we may be used to in this period. Visconti likewise was in power when Italy's most renowned Gothic cathedral was built, that is, the Duomo of Milan. Gentile then worked after his time in Lombardy in Venice, with so much exposure to the Eastern Mediterranean, which I'll come back to, and he took as an apprentice in his workshop Jacopo Bellini, who named his son Gentile Bellini after Gentile da Fabriano, and Gentile and Giovanni Bellini formed this amazing workshop in the late Quattrocento in Venice, as you recall from our Venetian episodes. When Gentile finally came to Florence, he was given patronage by the illustrious and wealthy Strozzi family, who commissioned his Adoration of the Magi for the Church of Santa Trinita. Okay, there are patrons other than the Medici. Now we're talking about the Strozzi. Okay, the style of this adoration is International Gothic. It can be difficult to conceptualize. We're talking about a high court style, one that demonstrates interactions among elite people such as the Strozzi and the Medici, and the wider world of noble court culture. So what is going on here in this painting? Okay, remember, Gentile is clearly working in the same tradition as Lorenzo Monaco. This looks Gothic. It is Gothic. It's International Gothic. But there's a lot of changes going on. Think again as you look at this. Okay, that's Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration of the Magi. The frame, the central main narrative, and the predella, that narrative that goes below the frame. That is one unified work. Okay, but gone is the solid gold background, replaced by a packed landscape with a stacked perspective. That means it's going up, but it's sort of recessing in space, but not really. In this way, we see the influence from Northern European courts. That is the landscape background replacing the solid gold background, one that shows the same figures along their journey in each lunette, those half circles under these arches. You see the Magi on the top left, you see them in the middle, and then you see them walking through the gates on the right, and then here they are in the very front middle, adoring the Christ child, another not so George Costanza baby. And yet, the scene does have some depth. The figures are foreshortened, some of them, which feigns recession. What is foreshortening? It is, look at the horse, the white horse, who's looking directly at us. We can imagine his body recesses into space. That is foreshortening. The horse's head in the middle right, whose snout is aimed towards us. That depth of his face, that is foreshortening, and it might leave some to be desired. And the figures are swirling, which is bringing your focus directly to the adoration scene. The frame itself, we're back to this Gothic frame with these Roman arches. There's another, just like Lorenzo Monaco in the trefoils that are above the frame. You have the Archangel Gabriel, Christ in the middle, the Virgin Annunciation on the right. It is standardized, just like Lorenzo Monaco, but here we have all of this gold. You see, in the framing itself, the arches are pointed, but it's got a trefoil in it with superimposed on a square. Very Gothic, with all of these little decorations around it. So this is a Gothic frame. This is a Gothic altarpiece, but it has all of these international influences that's speaking to the wider world of culture. Not to mention the Eastern dress of the Magi. We are looking at references to Islamic tapestries in their dress, which is directly contrasted with the plain, humble, monocolored sort of draperies of the Virgin and of her cohort. To her left, you have a brilliant, excellent, marvelous display of Pangentismo, that type of painting that you often celebrate Michelangelo for, in which the highlights of her dress, the very far left character in the foreground, are actually the opposite color, and that creates the dramatic fold in her drapery, so it's yellows and it's blues. It might be gilded in gold. I have to go look at this again. And then what's going on here? If you look very, very close to the halos of the main figures, Gentile da Fabriano has clearly seen Mamluk metalwork. That is bowls with Islamic inscriptions in a script called Kufic. That is a way of writing in Arabic. And pseudo-Kufic, that means it makes no sense. It says nothing, is inscribed, gilded, like metal in the gold halos of the figures. We're getting influence from the north, from the Northern Renaissance. We're getting influence from the Eastern Mediterranean. We are getting influence from the Western Mediterranean. That is International Gothic, the conscious display of stylistic connectivity that shows high court culture. Okay, does that make sense? It's the move towards a more lifelike naturalism becoming the bedrock for how painting practices continue to develop in Italy. The International Gothic bumps up directly with emerging classical revival and Renaissance humanistic thought and practice. They are concurrent and they inform each other. Gentile da Fabriano's adoration remains the absolute pinnacle of International Gothic painting in Italy. In the same years, the very same moment, the 1420s, the classicizing thinkers Filippo Brunelleschi and Leon Battista Alberti were working out how to solve the problem of linear perspective, something that would forever revolutionize the practices in Western painting. By the middle of the 1400s, the International Gothic style would be considered old-fashioned, much in the way Vasari discusses works in that style as working towards the absolute perfection of the arts of his period, biased or not. Thank you all for tuning in. That's all I have for Lorenzo Monaco, Gentile da Fabriano, and the Gothic style in Italy at the transition to Renaissance painting. Be sure to check out our social medias for images and commentary. Leave a review for the show, please. That helps out a lot and helps spread the word about this project as we continue to grow and expand our community. Until next time, arrivederci.